Hi there. This video is a compilation of my last 5 videos dealing with a new method I've come up for character design, especially aimed at beginners. I call it Explorative Copy. They will show you the basics of this method and how to use it for making cartoon characters. You can call it a mini course, or a mini version of the full thing, since most of these videos were taken out straight from a character design course that I'm currently working on, that deals exclusively with this new method. Hello there. We all know that the key to improving is making studies. Sitting down and making careful copies of the real world or other artist work with the express purpose of learning something and building a visual library you can use at the time of making your own drawings. But I'm gonna be honest, it never worked for me. I think the problem is that I find it stressful and unrewarding, especially when studying characters. The copy never ends up looking as good as the original, and I never feel like I've used my creativity or challenged my drawing skills. Well, it's been a while now that I've been working on a new system or method to sort of replace that way of learning. And I think I've come up with something really interesting. In this video, I will show you a really powerful technique that makes it so effortless and fun to learn complicated stuff that feels a bit like cheating. And what's more, you can easily turn the results into your own original drawings with very little work. And the first step of my method starts the same way than the traditional way, getting something you would like to study. For this video, I'll pick this simple character that looks amazing and should be relatively easy to study for all of us. This is not mine, sadly I couldn't find the name of the artist, but hopefully somebody in the comments can help us with that. A couple of tips for picking the right material to study. Keep at all times in your mind your own abilities as an artist. Pick a reference that fits with your skill level. If you're just starting out, don't pick a drawing by Kim Jong-gi. What you want is to be challenged, but still have certain amount of solvency to work fast and learn more effectively. You don't want to get stuck on a drawing for hours. Also, I would avoid any drawing that makes use of anatomy if you aren't familiar with that topic yet. This technique can be used for learning anatomy, but that's a whole different beast that I'm not getting into now. And here comes the important part. I'm gonna lower the opacity and trace over the main shapes, and only the main shapes. I don't care about those small details, just the big shapes that makes up the whole design. You want to end up with a simplified version of the design made of simple geometrical shapes. Here you have to use your brain to decide what's important enough and what can be ignored. This part is not hard to do, but it can be tricky if you're not used to ignoring the small shapes and focusing on the big elements. There's a lot more to this step than what you may think, depending on the complexity of the design you're going for and the areas you want to focus. Sadly, I don't have the time to go over that now, but I will cover that in the full course. And the end result should be basically some sort of mannequin with the proportions and shapes of the original art. Now we can dress it up with the final line. In fact, I would strongly recommend you to do that now. Lower the opacity and start copying the details over. This step is not necessary, but you wouldn't be losing anything, and it will only help you be more familiar with your subject. But here's the thing, that is not that important now, especially when you're just starting out. What we care now is about getting an intuitive sense of the shapes that makes the illustration and what is being communicated. And that's where the next step comes in. This is the most important part of this method. What we're gonna do now is to take the mannequin we made and make variations, changing the sizes and proportions, and making new mannequins that use the same shapes but looks completely different. Squash and stretch each shape, make them smaller or bigger, modify them if you're feeling adventurous. Do try to respect the relationships and connections. If you see a shape under another in the original, it would be a good idea that the new mannequin keep that same shape under the other as well, even if you completely change the proportions. Your goal is to vary the design of the mannequin, not to make something completely different. And I think you realize the idea here is to explore the different ways the same shapes makes up completely different designs. Of course, don't do this just one time. Make at least 5, 10, 20 variations. They will only help you get a more intuitive view on how different shapes and proportions affect the design. One of the things I found to be the most boring about making studies is copying the proportions. It feels useless to me since the proportions are unique for each character. It's not something you're gonna use or learn from. On the other hand, here you're actually practicing and evaluating how the proportions affect the design and seeing it for yourself, all without having to stress about making an accurate proportionate copy. And the final step is adding the details on top, just like you did with the first drawing, but this time basing yourself on the new mannequins you drew. If you followed my advice of not changing the relative placement and connections, then adapting the details to the new sizes and locations should be a breeze. Remember that you don't need to be super precious with what you're drawing. This is all for the sake of learning. You're not gonna show this to anyone. So the drawing doesn't need to be pretty. Try to be accurate to a certain point, but the more you do, the more you learn. The idea here is to learn the different ways shapes and sizes and proportions can completely change the way a drawing looks, as well as forcing you to improvise with the reference you have, which is what you'll be doing most of the time when you draw your own things. And that is the key to the whole exercise. You're not mindlessly copying something, you're forced to adapt it and make it work with slightly new configurations. You're forced to think. The exercise will only be complete once you adapt the details to every single one of your different versions you've made, or at least 5 to 10 of them. The fact that you're forced to do the details over and over again is important here because you're memorizing them, building that visual library, and at the same time you're thinking about them, learning to adapt them into different contexts. You're also becoming more and more expert at these particular details since you're doing them over and over again, which makes it easier for your brain to offload that burden and focus on being creative, which again is important when you're making your own things. I don't really think I need to mention this, but I will just in case. It's very important that you know that this is only for learning, not for showing. These are not really your own drawings in the same way that grabbing an image online and applying some filters in Photoshop does not make it your own. There's still work to do here, and having some of these can make up for a really strong base, especially if you're bringing more reference, but we won't be going over that in this video. I do go on detail on how to transform this into your very own drawings in the full course though. And that's it. As you can see, this is a really fun way to learn and study because it feels like you're drawing new things rather than mindlessly copying. If you're interested in learning more about this technique, especially how you could use it to make your own characters, make sure to like and subscribe. I'll be making more tutorials that summarize or employ ideas that will be covered in my course. Also, let me know what you think about this video in the comments below. That was all for now. Bye! Hello there! Last week I made a video of a system or method that I've been working on for some time that will help you learn and draw tons of characters really fast and super easily. Link in the description if you're interested. But that video was all about drawing traditionally with pencil and paper. I thought I could make an Inkscape version of the same tutorial for those who prefer to draw with keyboard and mouse, and also to show how to apply the same concepts, but taking advantage of the tools of the program. So this video will be about adapting that method to Inkscape. And if you check out that video, which I strongly recommend you to, even if you don't plan to draw, the concepts are the important thing, you will notice that there are quite a few differences worth exploring. But before continuing, a quick plug. I'm currently working on a new character design course, and the subject of this video will be part of it, expanded and with more detail of course. If you would like to help me during the production, I'm making available my special Inkscape courses bundle again, this time with the new course as an extra. That's 11 full Inkscape courses, over 70 hours of content on character design, background design, game art and more, all aimed at beginners. The courses are the ones showing on the screen. If you're interested, the whole bundle costs only $19 and it will help me and the channel a lot. Link in the description. That was all, continuing with the video. The first step of the method is finding reference. What we want is a single character that we're gonna study, and there are a couple of things to keep in mind when you're picking the character, especially when working entirely in Inkscape. First of all, you need to find a character that can be easily made with keyboard and mouse. That means a character like this, cartoon style, simple, maybe leaning a bit to a flat style, like the ones you see in Western cartoons. And the second requirement, and it's not that much of a requirement but a recommendation when you're starting out, is to find characters that are more or less in a neutral standing pose, and if possible in a front view. That will make everything much more easy. For the original video, I got this amazing character made by the artist Bar Guy. I was planning to use another different character for this video, But then I thought it may be more useful to see the differences by comparing the same method with the same character, but different medium. Also, the character happened to work fairly well with Inkscape anyway. So import the image into Inkscape. It may be useful to lock it and lower the opacity. And you can do that by opening the fill and stroke dialog and lowering the opacity. And then opening the Layers and Objects dialog and clicking in the little lock at the side of the image name. No need to create another layer or anything. The tracing is gonna be super simple. Now it's time to trace over with the pen tool. If you watched the previous video, which you should have, you'll know that what we want to do now is to find and trace only the big shapes. We want an indication of the shape and the proportions. We don't care about the details. Use rectangles and spheres and triangles, very simple shapes. So for example, the body will be just a single rectangle, the head will be a sphere and a triangle, and don't even bother with the arms, just a straight line will be enough. In the next step, we'll be moving these parts around to make new designs. That's the reason why we want them to be as simple as possible. If they are too complicated, modifying them and moving them around will be harder. So stay to super simple shapes that indicate only the rough shape and proportions of the reference. This simplified version of the character will work like a mannequin, that later on will append the details. But I'm getting ahead of myself. For now we're ready with this step. Now let's move to the next one. So here's where the most important part of the technique comes in. So far the mannequin we made matches the shape of the original artwork. If we wanted, we could start to copy the details and begin really learning and memorizing the shapes and patterns that we could use later on in our own characters. But I've discovered that we can go one step beyond and make something much more instructive and fun. What we're gonna do now is to grab these shapes and make a duplicate and then play around with the proportions and shapes to quickly build a completely different mannequin. Just use the object tool and scale and rotate and move all the shapes around. Maybe you can make the head twice as big as the original, or really squash the hat so it looks tiny in comparison. The same with the torso. Elongate it or make it shorter or wider. Grab the belt and put it all the way down or make it really big. And of course you can always grab the pen tool and make modifications to the shape, though because of the goal of this method, I don't recommend you to mess too much with the shapes, at least not to the point they become unrecognizable from the original version. You'll see why later. Don't be shy to use the node tool, just don't go overboard with it. Just play around with the shapes and try to make the mannequin look like a completely different thing. The idea here is that you get to experiment with completely different designs, but with the support of the original shapes, and with the knowledge that everything fits. And that's the thing, you don't want to create a completely different character. You want variations that show how these shapes construct the design. That's the reason why I recommend you not to delete or add any shape, or that you strafe too far away from the original model. Like for example, removing the hat altogether or taking the belt off. That will come later in a future tutorial. For now, your goal is to study how these reference and shapes in particular can make up different designs. You see now why I insisted in the previous step to work with simple shapes, because they are much easier to manipulate and use the node tool if you need. You'll notice that I'm making more than a single copy. This is essential. In the original video I say that you'll need to do between 5 and 15 variations of each design to truly understand it and memorize the details, and it's the same here. The more variations you make, the more engaged you are with the way the design works, and the more you learn. So do a minimum of 5 variations per character you study. Other than that, just use your artistic sense and imagination to see what looks good and what could look nice in a finished character. Once you have a good quantity of variations you're happy with, it's time for the last step, and probably the most fun one. And this step is the one where you'll see the biggest difference with the previous video, because now we can make use of the tools of Inkscape to speed up the process and just be more effective. This step is all about adapting the details of the original to the new mannequins. In the original video I just copied the details one by one from the original illustration, but now you can follow a different process. We're gonna trace over the original work and then distort these details to match the new mannequins. So once again lower the opacity and lock the reference, and using the pen tool and built-in objects, start tracing over the shape. Very important, use closed shapes. Even if there are open areas, always use closed shapes, it makes everything easier. You can sample the color of the reference to see how it looks in color, and of course you should go grouping the shapes of the objects as you are completing them, so they are easier to reuse. One very important thing here, we do not want any type of built-in shape in our groups. This is important because we are going to use the path effects to adapt them in the best possible way to the shape of the new mannequins. And path effects do not work well with groups that have a combination of pen-made shapes and built-in shapes. So don't forget to transform them to paths by going to Path, Object to Path. Once you're done, all objects should be separated in groups and ready to be reused. And that's what we're gonna do now. Grab these objects, duplicate them and try to make them fit into the shapes of the other mannequins. So here are a couple of tips to do that. Try to make them fit by using the least amount of modifications possible. It's not always gonna be possible to just move one object to the other side and make it fit, but whenever you can, only use the transformations of the object tool, and only as a last resource, start applying path effects. I'm sure you're wondering which path effects to use, and here are the ones I thought are the most important ones. For long limbs like the arms and legs, you can use the bend effect. This makes it enormously easy to adjust them to any position. For simple distortions of objects, use the envelope deformation. And for the more complex distortions, where you need to distort only some areas but not others, use lattice deformation. With these three should be more than enough. If a character does not look 100% right, remember that this is only an exercise for learning and studying the details and practice. You're not gonna show this to anyone. And that's a very important point I want to make sure to leave completely clear. You shouldn't show this to anyone. These are not your own characters, no matter how different they look from the original. These are studies of the work made by other artists. Now, these studies could be the starting point for making your own characters later on, but I won't be dealing with that in this video. Make sure to check out the course when it's ready, where I do go on detail on how to create your very own characters properly. So that's it for today. While I still think that using pen and paper is better for drawing than going full keyboard and mouse with Inkscape, I still have a soft spot for it, and I think it has much more potential than what people gives it credit for. So let me know in the comments what are your thoughts about this method. And one final thing, I make videos about Inkscape every week, so if you're interested, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell. Also, any like and comment is highly appreciated and helps the channel a lot. That's all for now, bye! If you completed the exercises as I recommended, you've likely noticed how fun and effective this method is for learning. It's an excellent way to really embed knowledge into your memory. Additionally, it's a fantastic approach to tackle something that feels just out of reach, something more complex than you feel ready for. And this is what this lesson is going to be about. I'm sure you've encountered drawings that seem a bit too complex. Maybe you gave them a try and failed to copy them or felt overwhelmed. The next few lessons will deal with that. Learning to see and understand, and of course study, more complex drawings, so you can draw more complex things. And first, we are going to see a technique that's very well known and really basic, and that can be really helpful with any character, not just with the complex ones. In fact, if you've experimented with the method yourself, chances are you've probably came with something similar. I don't think it has a name, but I call it layering, because you use different layers of shapes or mannequins, as we named them in the last lesson, to get the final result. Take a look at this illustration. This is the sort of drawing that would have intimidated me a few months ago, before I had a systematic way to approach it. Perhaps it doesn't intimidate you, but hopefully you can see it's a bit more complex than the examples from the previous lessons. If we trace all the shapes that affect the design, like in the last lesson, we'll end up with something like this. Every shape matches with an element of the drawing, something that affects the design. If we want now, we can very easily make a copy, because everything fits perfectly. It is not really that hard to do once you have this. What it is hard to do is to get to these shapes to begin with. Because there are so many, it's kinda difficult to copy on its own. It's still easier than going straight in without any shape, because they are simple shapes, but it's not as easy as it could be. However, there is a very obvious solution to this problem if you think about it, and that is using different layers of mannequins. We start with a very easy to draw and simple mannequin that matches the big shapes, and then we use that mannequin to build a new one for the finer details. And we repeat these steps until we get to the final mannequin, the one we are going to use to add the line art. That was so hard to get to. So looking at the example of this knight, let's follow the full process until we get to the line art. The very first layer should be simplify the illustration as much as possible, using as few shapes as you can while completely matching it. So you have to balance and evaluate what is really important and what's worth a shape. In this case, I thought to use a single shape for the torso, another for the head. The legs, I decided to join them as a single shape. To me, it helps me being more accurate when they are not straight and parallel to each other. And the cape could have been a single shape, but I don't know why I separated it into two. Usually at this stage it won't be necessary to use more than 4 or 5 shapes for it to feel like the original drawing. And here are a few more examples of other mannequins at this first layer. Stop the video and study them if you need. From here we could jump directly to the final mannequin, using the proportions and shape to build on top, but if the illustration is complex enough, we could also add another mannequin in between. For this mannequin there is a bit more detail. You can think of it as increasing the resolution, detailing the smaller shapes, like the shoulder plate or the loincloth and the arms and separation of the legs. And more examples of this level of mannequin. With this in place, it's easier to build that difficult mannequin we saw earlier. This is the final one. At this stage, every important design element in the character should be simplified into a simple shape, just like in the last lesson. The only difference here is that there are a ton of elements to simplify, but otherwise it's the same, that hopefully you practiced a lot. A few examples of this final layer. And now with the final mannequin, the line art is easy to make. A good mannequin that follows correctly the drawing is a bit like one of those grids that people starting out use to make copying easier. Only that we have the flexibility of drawing it in any way we want. And yes, it may take some practice to get used to copying more complex things, like with everything in art, but after you get comfortable, the line art stage becomes the most mindless stage of the study. And here we have the copy of a fairly complex drawing done, but moving on, a couple of things to keep in mind. First, this is such a basic technique that you can use it with anything, including simple illustrations. If it's not something really super basic, you will get some benefit out of doing it in at least 2 layers. More on this later on the course. Though using it adds a bit of an overhead to the process, so if it's not necessary, don't use it. And second, usually there's not gonna be necessary to use more than 3 layers. Most drawings you can use 2, a simple layer that handles the body and other main shapes, and a second layer with the final mannequin. So don't go overboard on the quantity of layers. Adding too many layers won't make it easier to draw. Okay, but now it's time to apply the layers to the explorative copy method from last lesson. Everything will stay more or less the same, but I do have a couple of tips I want to share. If you remember from before, the first step is to find mannequins by tracing over. And I strongly recommend you to first find all the mannequins you are gonna use before you get to the method. This is more important now because you may need to adjust them or even change them. Making these mannequins by tracing is not particularly hard, but it's not unusual for the first one you make to suck and not be as simple or as easy as it could be. So before drawing anything, take a good time to make all the mannequins you're gonna use. That will also get you familiar with the reference, which will make it even easier to draw later on. The way I recommend you to make variation now is by first going by layers. So you make multiple variations of the first layer before moving on to the next one and so forth. This is useful because it makes you hyper familiar with the current layer you are working on and with the essence of the design. The same tips than before apply. Draw between 5 to 15 copies. Create as much variety as you can while matching the pose and perspective, and try to create diversity in design by variating different groups of shapes. As you can see, some of my mannequins have big heads and short bodies, while others have small heads and huge bodies, I even messed up with the cape, since it's an important part of the design as well. Now we move to the next layer. This time we are not tracing over, so we only have the previous mannequin to guide us. That means this step is probably gonna be the hardest. Still, what's nice now is that we can add some extra variety, because we don't have to stay to the proportions found in the traced mannequin. Now we have true creative power, and that means we have to learn to improvise. You'll notice that some of these mannequins have such different proportions to the original that I needed to make some adjustments. For example, in this one, the legs are so small that the loincloth hides most of the back leg, something it does not happen in the original. And this one, the arms are so big that they cover a big portion of the torso, including completely obscuring the belt. Also, you'll notice that I have to improvise a few very bizarre swords to match the new location of the arms. The final layer, the final mannequin. This time it's just a matter of adapting the traced mannequin into the new proportions. That means some parts of it will have to be either omitted, or in some cases you'll have to improvise some sections. In this case, the mannequin with the short legs that I mentioned a second ago, the left leg was just too short. I couldn't fit all the 3 pieces of armor, so I decided I would just omit the one on the knee. And for the big guy with the big arms, like I said before, the arm covers a big portion of the torso, so there were quite a lot of things I couldn't draw. When you have these mannequins done, it is very easy to imagine how the final illustration could look, so if you're not fully convinced of the variation by this stage, chances are that making the line art on top is not gonna do much for you. So you know you can save time by scrapping that variation. And then the final stage is just adapting the line art. Here comes the reward for your hard labor, where you get to see new cool variations made entirely by you. Here is also where you apply the ability to improvise based on reference, the same as before, but even more weightful now because the designs are more complex. Not much to say here other than I switched the symbol of the sun that was everywhere on the night for a much simpler circle, because it was super complex and it added nothing and it took ages to draw. That's the same reason why I only made 4 variations. You, on the other hand, try to keep it to at least 5, even on complex studies. So, to summarize, if you find a character too complex, you always have the options of studying it using layers, which means building mannequins one on top of another, increasing in complexity, until you reach a final, kinda complex mannequin that you will use to add the line art. The first layer of mannequin should match the design with no more than 4 or 5 big shapes, and the final one should have as many shapes as necessary to match it completely. So it's easier to add the final line art on top later. Usually you won't need more than 2 or 3 layers of mannequins to handle even the most complex illustrations. Remember to find the shapes first and then move on to make variations. It is really helpful to have this base version to guide you. When making variations, it's easier to variate in stages, keeping it at 1 layer at a time. Now for the exercises. Find 10 drawings that you think are just above your level, that intimidates you, but that you feel you could tackle it with effort. The same limitations from before apply. For now, stay to characters in a relatively neutral standing pose and stay away from all sorts of anatomy. Then, of course, you study them using our method, like I show you here. Follow the 3 steps, finding the mannequins, variating them, and drawing the line art. You cannot always rely on cartoon reference at the moment of making your own characters. Eventually you'll want to start using real-life reference, not only because of the risk of ending up with something too derivative of some other artist's work, but also because cartoons represent an already digested version of reality, and that will limit what you can do with it. We'll see later on the course that real-life reference is essential for a couple of things, but especially when you want to dress up your characters. It's important that you know how to take a real-life picture and make it fit with your cartoon character. Of course, we are building on top of our system of explorative copy, which already forces you to play around with the proportions and make exaggerated and cartoony looking things. And yes, that is a great place to start with, because cartooning is all about playing with shapes and proportions. But there are more things to keep in mind when using real-life reference. So consider this lesson as a few tips to cartoonize real-life reference to use with our characters. Now, I'm not an expert cartoonist or draftman by any stretch of the word, but in my experience, I found 3 important elements or concepts to keep in mind at the moment of cartooning something. That is exaggeration, clarity, and simplicity. The most straightforward concept to apply is exaggeration. You're already changing the proportions using our system. Now it's time to change them with purpose. So your first goal should be to identify the parts of the reference that looks odd or unique or goofy, and make that part really big or really small, or any other transformation that will point out the weirdness. In the case of this helmet, I realized that the mouth area has this sort of very weird extrusion. It looks really odd. So I knew that was a great place to start making variations. To cartoon it, we use the exact same explorative copy method than before, only that now we make variations that target the mouthpiece in a specific. The most intuitive thing to do is to make the weird area larger, but you can also go the other way around and make it smaller and see what happens. A particular reference can have a ton of possible things to make fun of. Your goal is to find out what are those areas and make variations with the specific purpose of accentuating the weirdness in some way or another. The next concept to keep in mind is clarity. What I mean by clarity is that every part of a cartoon should be immediately clear to read, something that does not always happen with real-life pictures. A nice rule of thumb I have is that every part should be obvious, noticeable, and explicit. A very common thing you'll use reference in cartoons is for weapons. If you look at the sword, it is filled with interesting shapes, the hilt and pommel and guard and blade. It's all really awesome looking, but because the shapes are very subtle, it is not as obvious. The solution is to exaggerate those areas to make the design more clear at first read. Similar than before, but this time we are making them more visible rather than changing their size. And just to demonstrate this, I'm drawing the sword with the same proportions than the reference. Most of the time you'll achieve this by making those areas thicker, not just bigger. Another example. The boot has layers and layers of metal armor that makes it easier to get lost. I'm sure it's more or less accurate to real life and there is a valid reason for all of that, but the problem is that it is not immediately clear what's going on or what part does what. So our goal now is to make some adjustments so the separation of layers of armor is clear and easy to read. Again, you can play with the proportions to make some things bigger, but this principle is all about making sure everything is readable, and that includes making some of these lips at the borders thicker, and this is important, eliminating some of the noise by adding empty space around it. If everything is clumped up altogether, it is hard to read, so don't be afraid of outright deleting some sections that appear in the reference. That's the reason why my version do not have any belts. There was no space for them on the back, and I think the end result looks fine. So hopefully it's clear how important it is for a cartoony drawing to be easily read. Every part should be obvious and noticeable, and if they are not, you should delete them. The final concept I came up with is simplicity. Even if everything is all nice and clear, if there is too much information, too much things, then the drawing will tend to not feel cartoony. This principle is similar to the principle of clarity, but this time we want to make sure the things that we are drawing are simple to begin with. In practice, this means that you do not want to follow the reference one-to-one, and you may need to remove some pieces and adjust them to your needs. It is a very common situation you'll find yourself all the time. We got a nice reference of an armor to the right and a mannequin to the left. We haven't seen how to make bodies yet, so for now these simple shapes will have to do. We want to adapt the reference on the right to the character on the left, but you'll notice how complicated the reference is. It's filled with layers and layers of differently textured armor, with tons of belts and bolts and textural detail. This is just too complex. If we want to use a version of this armor, we're gonna need to simplify everything. And here comes a nice little technique that I strongly recommend you to use when using this sort of complex reference. Lower the opacity and start tracing over it. Do not trace it exactly as it is. Instead, trace it as you would like it to be. Much more simple, skipping all that unnecessary details and any shapes that you feel you don't need. It's so much easier to be creative and experiment when you're drawing right on top of the reference, and you don't have to worry about being accurate or making all the pieces fit together. Of course, you are forced to stay to the proportions, but we'll take care of that ourselves in the next step. And if you compare the two versions, you'll notice how much I really simplified the original version. It has a lot less stuff going on. It's clearer and it still manages to keep the whole feeling of the original armor. And now the whole process of adapting the details to our mannequin is much easier. We're gonna take this trace over and use it as the source for our variations. We don't need the actual reference anymore, we are replacing it. Because we don't have to do this simplification on the fly as we are drawing, it's much easier to focus on getting everything right on the variation. Now you follow the same steps as before, deconstructing our new reference and making variations and all of that. There are many ways to simplify a complex reference, and a lot of them have to do with the level of complexity of the cartoon you're going for. In this first example, I went for a bit more realistic cartoon, but if you want to draw something even more cartoony, then you'll need to simplify the reference even further. And there it is, a much simpler cartoon version of the exact same reference. There is one last type of problem you will encounter when translating real-life references, and it's related to the concept of simplicity. Patterns. Of anything, any type of shape that's repeated over and over again. In general, any kind of repeating pattern is difficult to cartoonize. So here goes a very simple rule of thumb. Just simplify the pattern by making the shapes of the pattern bigger and made of less quantity of items. This will depend on the style of cartoon. The more cartoony the style, the more simple the pattern should be, with less and bigger shapes. In this example, the armor has all the little rectangles, which I assume are made of leather, with a cord in the center. It's just too many of them. It won't read as a cartoon. So we need to draw less vertical divisions and bigger and less quantity of rectangles. And now it looks a bit more fitting for a cartoon character. Okay, that was it for this lesson on using real-life pictures. In summary, to make a real-life reference match with your cartoons, it's not just a matter of playing with the proportions. You have to keep in mind three concepts or tools at the moment of drawing: exaggeration, clarity, and simplicity. Exaggeration involves playing with the proportions with purpose, thinking about what makes the reference unique or weird or funny, and exaggerate that. Clarity involves making sure everything is properly readable. Two important tools to use here is to thicken and enlarge everything that's important and delete everything else. Simplicity is about not being too complex with the end result. The reference can be complex, but you don't usually want the cartoon version to be. A nice little tool you can use to handle the complexity is to simplify as you're tracing over. This makes the simplification way easier. For the exercises, just grab 10 pieces of real-life reference. I recommend you to go for costumes, which is the most likely thing you'll use real-life reference for. You can also go for other holding items like weapons or potions or books. Make a study of each with at least 5 variations. Try different levels of cartooning, make them more or less realistic, experimenting with your favorite style. Hello everybody! In this video, I will show you how to take a picture reference and transform it into a cartoon character. Very important, what we're gonna see here will build upon 3 prior videos where I show you a fairly unique method to study and draw characters. Link to all of them in the description. Make sure to give them a quick watch. They're super short and to the point, and they will give you the context you need to understand everything here. One final warning before starting: this video is taken directly out of an upcoming course I'm working on, the same with the other videos, so keep that in mind. And speaking of the course I'm working on, if you would like to help me during the production and get the course for free once it's ready, right now I'm making my special all courses bundle available again. That's 10 full courses, plus the new one on character design, background design, game art and Inkscape, about 70 plus hours of content, all for $19. It's only for a limited time until I finish the course. After that, the bundle will be no longer available, and those who purchase it will get this new course for free in an update. That was all. Let's continue with the lesson. Let's begin with the most straightforward way to make a character using our system, and that is applying the explorative study method to a real-life picture. Like we did in the cartooning lesson, but apply it to the whole body, to make a whole character. This method, in my opinion, has its drawbacks, as you'll see later on in the lesson, but it can be a great starting point to make your own characters. Plus, we are gonna build upon this for the more advanced methods of character creation we're gonna see in future lessons. By now you probably know the drill. We start gathering reference, this time real-life pictures. But here are some tips and just things to keep in mind at the moment of picking the right reference. First of all, because now you are making your own characters, and chances are you may want to show them, you want to pay special attention to the copyright of the reference. Most of the time you will not have any problem for as long as you stay away from copyrighted characters or costumes, like cosplays or pictures taken from a production, which may result in an accidental cartoon version of an already existing character. Ideally, you'd want a picture taken by you, of yourself or a friend. This way you're making sure everything is okay legally, but of course most people don't have pirates or Viking costumes ready to be used at any moment. So just be careful of what picture you're using. Make some light investigation before you start drawing. And one final thing related to that, I know this is a bit of a controversial topic, but searching for reference on Pinterest, I found out a lot of the best references were created with AI. I don't know how you feel personally about using AI as an artist, but in the case of using it for reference, that might be just the most ethically correct use you could give it right now, at least in my opinion. This way, you could avoid any copyright problem and get the exact thing you need. But it's up to you if you feel that's an acceptable use case or not. Continuing with more artistic tips, make sure you get a reference of a full body, so you have all the information you need. Don't invent anything. We'll leave that for the next lesson. Be careful of references with tons of clothes and folds. Clothing is a subject to study on its own, just like anatomy. We don't need that extra complexity right now. Don't skip fabric with folds, but if you see too much complexity going on, maybe switch to another reference. A bit more on anatomy. Avoid reference where there is a lot of the body showing, at least for now. Later on we'll see more about this. And also related, the head, the face. We haven't seen that yet, so I recommend you to skip references that show the face too much. Of course, I don't mean you should go get references of decapitated people, but perhaps you want to study references that have the face covered, at least partially, with helmets or hoods. At least for now, until we see the face in more detail later on, though you can always just not draw the face. And the final tip, this has to do more with the whole process rather than the first step of gathering references. If you see that you cannot properly cartoonize a full body reference, maybe the problem is the particular reference you gathered. Try another one. It has happened to me that some pictures, for some reason, seems like they are easy to study, but then you try to cartoonize it and it just doesn't look good. Maybe it's an issue with the reference, or perhaps a tricky pose, or maybe something that just falls out of your current knowledge. Don't sweat it, that happens to me all the time. Just try with another reference. Let's see a quick example. I know you've done this a ton of times and you probably don't need an example, but you haven't seen how to apply it to a full character of your own, so let's look at a quick one. If you remember in the cartooning lesson, I mentioned a technique to solve the problems of transforming a real-life thing into a cartoon. Before you start with the variations, rewatch that lesson if you need. This technique is super simple. Just trace over and find what is going to be deleted and what's going to be left. And it's done. This is the drawing we will be making variations on. This is our new reference. We don't need a real-life picture anymore. This should be easier to draw, because it's the same as the other cartoon explorations we've been doing so far, only that this time you made a cartoon. Because most humanoid characters are gonna be kinda complex, most likely you'll need to use the layering method, and depending on the complexity of some areas, you may need to use the focusing method. Remember, Some of the common areas of complexity tend to be the hands and feet and head. We are not doing heads right now, and the hands and feet of this character are not that complicated, so we are doing just 2 simple layers. Now it's time for the variations. I'll be doing just 3 to demonstrate, but as always, the more you do, the better they'll come up. Now it's just the exact same process than before. First the layers and then you build from there. While I'm finishing the drawings, I would like to go over a few things to keep in mind when making characters using this method. First of all, after you finish your first variations, you will start to see the limitations of using a single reference. The problem is that what looks good in real life does not always translate that good to a cartoon. Real life has a ton of small little details that keep the eye occupied and make something cool, while the same things in a cartoon can end up feeling distracting. And this results in a drawing that feels either empty or that lacks something. At this stage, every part of my artist's brain is telling me to start doing something with these empty spaces, to start adding maybe some inner details or start drawing something else here and there. But I want to stay to what we are seeing in this lesson, so I'm not gonna. Using a single reference can be a great starting point, but if you want something that looks better, more unique and more in control over how it looks, you'll need to complement it with other references. I originally planned to go over that here in this lesson, but it came up too lengthy and I like my lessons to be laser focused. So we're gonna see that in the next one. For now, let's move on to the summary and the exercises. The most straightforward method to create a cartoon character using our explorative study method is by using it with real-life reference. Gather pictures of real-life people in costumes or just normal people that you think will make for a good cartoon, and proceed with an explorative study using everything we've seen so far. Using real-life reference, however, can bring in some pains, like for example copyrighted images or reference with things we haven't seen so far, like faults or anatomy, which you should avoid for now. Also, if a particular reference gives you too much trouble, consider just trying another one. Sometimes it just happens. Copying real-life reference can be hard and sometimes the reference is not cooperating, so don't sweat it. At the moment of making the study, remember that everything we saw applies here as well. But you may want to check out again that lesson on cartooning real-life reference. Also, if the end result is less than impressive, or just don't look or feel as good as the reference, that's normal. Often real-life reference does not have the same amount of information a cartoon would need. That's why you may be tempted to invent something to fill the empty space or just add some extra stuff. A direct implementation of a real-life reference may not look 100% correct all the time. That's why you usually do not use a single reference, but more on that later. For the exercises, I think you know what it's gonna be. Just gather a suitable real-life reference, of course, I mean a full body of a character, and adapt it to a cartoon. Do at least 10 studies with at least 5 variations each. If you want, you can invent new things to supply any fault you see in the adaptation, that's fine, but usually I don't recommend you to just invent stuff, at least for now. If the end result looks empty, just accept it, and in the next lesson I'll show you how to fix that. I decided to record the rendering on Inkscape because I realized most of my subscribers are here for Inkscape, not for the basics of drawing. So I thought to add this section to this video, which won't be on the course version, and that hopefully will give you a more complete picture of how to sketch out characters and then move them to Inkscape to finish them. So here are all the images imported and ready to be used inside of Inkscape. I will be rendering the 3 of them at the same time, and I hate to send you to yet another video, but I did upload to my channel a full course on how to do this, how to render and finish sketches in Inkscape. I will leave you the link below. That will get you up and running with everything I'm doing now. Though I'm not gonna go in depth into anything in this video, I just thought that video could help you. But just to summarize what I'm doing here, I lowered the opacity of the layer with the reference I'm gonna trace, and locked the layer so I can't interact with it anymore. And because we're gonna use field shapes, I created another layer and sent it below. I'm gonna work on that layer. Because the reference layer above is transparent, due to the lower opacity, I can still see what I'm tracing as I'm working with the fill shapes. That is a nice hack I love to use. I'm tracing using closed shapes mainly because I plan to work on all three variations at the same time, and I do plan to reuse as much as I can. You'll notice that I'm doing one part and then adapting that part to all the other variations, since it's basically the same shapes but with different proportions. This saves me a lot of time, and the more variations I'd had to trace, the more time I'd save. If you're interested in learning the specifics of how to reuse shapes and adapt them to different variations, check out this video in particular. Notice that first I'm tracing over on the realistic version. There is no specific reason to do this, I just wanted to see how the realistic looking version would look, so I thought to start there. I love making the rendering in Inkscape because, believe it or not, this is the easiest and most mindless part of the whole deal. The sketch was the hardest part. Now all you have to do is to fix and retouch a few technical inaccuracies that it may have. The fact that we are working with a vector software and with the mouse, to me, it helps me to take this part much more easy. I don't feel that I have to be perfect with the line, and I can edit and adjust as much as I want. So if I had to choose, I will always pick rendering in a vector software and with the keyboard and mouse, rather than using a traditional raster software. And here I would like to repeat something I briefly mentioned in the first video. I tend to make the sketches here much more clean than they are necessary. I do this mostly so it looks better on video, but everything I'm drawing, including all variations you've seen, made both on paper and on Inkscape, are just sketches, a quick drawing made for the purpose of learning, or in this case, meant to be refined later on. My sketches aren't the most clean or finished pieces ever, but still you certainly can go much more rough than what I do with them. Okay, color. I quickly searched for reference in Pinterest. I wanted to give it a cartoon version of the same colors from the image, and I got a couple of references that use similar color schemes, just to have a direction to start picking the colors. I'm not entirely happy with them, I feel I could just experiment more, but I'm satisfied and I think they work with the characters. And now for the shadow. This is where it will give it that 3D look and that clean finish. Basically it's the same technique as always, a dark blue color with low opacity, implying a top right light, a few contact shadows, and of course the black outline I love so much. And this is it for this video. I hope this extra Inkscape section has demonstrated the type of illustration you can easily come up with using a single reference and my explorative copy method. In the course, I will go much more in depth to what we've seen, so if you're interested, make sure to get my courses bundle while you can. The truth is that I've had some personal issues that have prevented me from working on the new course as much as I wanted. I did not delay it on purpose. I'm working really hard so I can finish it as soon as possible. That was everything for now. I hope these videos have been of help. See you next week for a new tutorial on Inkscape and illustration. Bye!